If you are a true believer, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with your friends and family. What if I told you the book of Genesis holds secrets that could transform how you see the Bible and God's grand plan? Genesis isn't just a story of beginnings, it's the blueprint for understanding everything in the Bible. Hidden within its ancient stories are mysteries that reveal God's purpose, His covenants, and His vision for humanity. From the creation of the world to the promises given to Abraham, Genesis is the foundation upon which all Scripture is built. In today's video, we'll uncover these powerful truths, exploring how Genesis reveals God's divine plan in ways you may have never realized. If you are a true believer, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us in uncovering the Bible's most ancient secrets. If you are a true believer, please subscribe to our channel. Genesis opens with the awe-inspiring words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." These words are not just an introduction, they are a powerful declaration of God's ultimate authority and sovereignty over all creation. At a time when there was only chaos and void, God spoke the universe into existence. This beginning wasn't random or accidental, it was intentional, deliberate, and perfectly ordered. The creation account in Genesis is a proclamation of divine order, where God methodically brings forth light out of darkness, life out of nothingness, and purpose from the chaos. With each day of creation, we see God's intricate design unfolding. He separates light from darkness, creates the heavens and the earth, and fills them with life and beauty. From the vastness of the stars in the sky to the detailed complexity of every living creature, nothing was left to chance. Everything had a purpose, and everything fit into God's perfect plan. The number of days, 7, reflects the completion and perfection of God's work. On the seventh day, when God rested, it wasn't a pause out of exhaustion, but rather a divine proclamation that His creation was finished, whole, and complete. Creation is not only about the formation of the physical universe, it is the foundational moment where God's relationship with humanity begins. In this story, we witness the depth of God's love and care for His creation. He designed the world with intention, crafting a space where humanity could thrive, worship, and grow closer to Him. The creation story is the first revelation of God's character, His creativity, power, wisdom, and most importantly, His desire for order and purpose in the universe. As we reflect on these opening verses, it becomes clear that the story of creation is also a story of us. We are not just spectators in this divine plan, but participants. God's intentionality in forming the world around us is mirrored in His intentionality for each of our lives. Just as He separated light from darkness, He offers us the chance to walk in His light, live with purpose, and be part of His grand design. Genesis 1:27 proclaims a pivotal moment in the creation story. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. With these words, humanity is introduced as the crowning achievement of God's creative work. Unlike the animals and the rest of creation, mankind was uniquely formed to bear the image and likeness of God. This likeness is not a physical resemblance, but a reflection of God's character, creativity, and authority over the earth. The creation of mankind was intentional and purposeful. Being made in God's image means that every human life has intrinsic value, dignity, and worth. This likeness also comes with a special calling, to reflect God's dominion and stewardship over creation. Humanity was entrusted with the responsibility to care for the world, to cultivate it, and to multiply life in alignment with God's design. But the creation of mankind also reveals something else about God, His desire for relationship. By forming humans in His image, God established the groundwork for an intimate, personal connection with His creation. The phrase, male and female, he created them, emphasizes the completeness of humanity in both man and woman. Together, they reflect the full image of God. Their creation wasn't an afterthought, but a deliberate act to showcase the beauty of unity and diversity. It also highlights the importance of companionship and partnership in fulfilling God's purpose on earth. Man and woman were not only given the breath of life, but also a divine mandate to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. God's command to subdue the earth and have dominion over it was a call to act as stewards, ensuring that creation would thrive under their care. The creation of man and woman stands as a powerful reminder that we are more than physical beings. We are spiritual creatures, bearing the imprint of our Creator and carrying the responsibility to reflect His goodness in the world. In Genesis 3, the serene and perfect world that God created is shattered by an act of disobedience. Adam and Eve, who were placed in the Garden of Eden to live in harmony with God's creation, encounter the serpent, an embodiment of temptation and deception. The serpent questions God's command, convincing Eve that eating from the forbidden tree would open her eyes and make her like God, knowing good and evil. Seduced by the promise of wisdom and autonomy, Eve takes the fruit and eats it, offering it to Adam, who also eats. In that single act of defiance, sin enters the world, and the perfection of creation is fractured. Their decision to disobey God's clear command wasn't just about eating fruit. It was about choosing to step outside of God's will, to grasp for control and power that was never theirs to take. This moment marks the beginning of humanity's separation from God, a fall from the innocence and purity they once had. For the first time, Adam and Eve experienced shame, fear, and guilt, hiding from God and each other as they realize their nakedness. The consequences are immediate and devastating. The ground is cursed, relationships are broken, and death becomes a reality. But this fall is more than a moment of judgment. It sets the stage for the greatest narrative in Scripture, the need for redemption. Humanity's relationship with God is damaged, but from this very point, God begins to lay out His plan to restore what was lost. Though Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, God's grace is still evident. He covers them with garments, symbolizing His continued care despite their disobedience. This act foreshadows the ultimate covering of sin that will come through Jesus Christ. The fall is a reminder of our need for redemption and the lengths to which God will go to bring us back to Himself. In Genesis 4, we encounter the first recorded act of murder, a tragic event that underscores the rapid spread of sin throughout humanity. Cain, the firstborn of Adam and Eve, harbored deep jealousy toward his younger brother Abel. The brothers both brought offerings to God. Abel's offering of the best of his flock was accepted, while Cain's offering from his crops was not. Rather than responding with humility and repentance, Cain allowed jealousy and anger to consume him. In a devastating act of violence, Cain lured his brother into the field and took his life. This story is not just about the act of murder. It reveals how quickly sin can escalate when left unchecked. The seeds of jealousy, pride, and anger lead to hatred and ultimately to death. Cain's actions broke not only the bond of brotherhood, but also his connection to God. When God confronts him, Cain's defiance is evident in his infamous response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The consequences of this sin ripple outward. Cain is marked and cursed, doomed to wander the earth. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, God shows mercy by placing a protective mark on Cain, ensuring that no one would take his life. This tragic event serves as a warning about the destructive power of sin, particularly when it invades relationships. Cain's story reflects humanity's ongoing struggle with emotions like jealousy and pride, and reminds us that sin, when unchecked, leads to further separation from God and from one another. By the time we reached Genesis 6, the world had become filled with wickedness, violence, and corruption. Humanity, created in God's image, had turned away from his ways, and evil had consumed nearly all of creation. But in the midst of this darkness, one man stood out, Noah. Noah found favor in God's eyes, described as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. God, in his mercy, chose Noah and his family to carry the hope of humanity forward. He instructed Noah to build an ark, a vessel of salvation that would preserve a remnant of life as the world faced impending judgment. The flood that followed was a monumental act of divine judgment. The waters covered the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, wiping away the corruption that had spread across the land. But the story of Noah's Ark is not only about destruction, it's also a profound story of grace. God did not abandon his creation. Instead, he preserved a remnant through Noah, ensuring that life would continue and giving humanity a chance to start anew. The ark became a symbol of God's protection, while the floodwaters represented judgment and purification. After the waters receded, God made a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood. The sign of this covenant was the rainbow, a reminder of God's mercy and his enduring faithfulness to humanity. Through Noah, we see both the severity of sin's consequences and the hope of redemption as God begins his plan to renew and restore creation. In Genesis 11, we encounter one of the most striking moments in biblical history, the story of the Tower of Babel. At this point in time, humanity was unified in language and purpose, working together toward a common goal. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This drive to build wasn't just about creating a city or an architectural marvel. It was about human ambition to reach the heavens, to make themselves equal with God. The Tower of Babel stands as a symbol of humanity's prideful desire to transcend their earthly limitations and elevate themselves to a divine status. This was an attempt to control their destiny and defy the natural order that God had established. This collective ambition reflects a deeper human tendency towards arrogance, much like the temptation that led to the fall in the Garden of Eden. Here again, we see humans seeking to become like God, acting out of pride and self-reliance. By attempting to build a tower to the heavens, the people of Babel wanted to create a name for themselves, securing their own legacy and destiny without God's guidance. This act of rebellion was not merely about constructing a physical structure. It was a defiance of God's authority and a direct challenge to his sovereignty. In their desire to make themselves invincible, the people ignored the very foundation of their existence, dependence on their Creator. But God, in his wisdom, chooses not to destroy them outright. Instead, he intervenes in a way that brings about the very outcome they feared, scattering across the earth. He confuses their language so they can no longer communicate and cooperate effectively. The once unified people, bound by a common language and purpose, are now divided. This confusion brings an end to their ambitious project, and the people disperse, forming the foundations of the diverse languages and cultures we see across the globe today. What had been a monument to human pride and ambition now stands incomplete, a reminder of the limitations of human power and the futility of trying to challenge God's authority. More than just a tale of scattered languages, the Tower of Babel is a warning about the dangers of pride. It highlights the consequences of trying to live without God and pursuing greatness for its own sake. This event shows us that human achievement, when rooted in defiance of God, will never lead to lasting success. In scattering the people, God teaches us an essential truth. Our strength, wisdom, and ambition must always be aligned with His will if we are to fulfill our true purpose. Moreover, The story of Babel marks a turning point in the biblical narrative. Humanity is no longer united in its defiance of God, and instead, the division of languages and cultures sets the stage for the unfolding of God's plan to reach all nations. This division, while initially a consequence of disobedience, becomes part of God's greater design to spread his message and bring salvation to the ends of the earth. The story reminds us that in the end, it is God's plan, not human ambition, that will prevail. Genesis takes a pivotal turn with the call of Abraham in chapter 12, where God's plan for redemption begins to unfold in a profound way. At this point, humanity has experienced the fall, the flood, and the scattering at Babel. But now God initiates his redemptive work by choosing one man to be the father of a great nation. God speaks to Abraham, then known as Abram, with a divine promise. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Genesis 12:2-3. Abraham's call marks the beginning of God's covenant relationship with his chosen people, a covenant that will eventually lead to the coming of the Messiah. This moment is significant not only for Israel, but for all humanity. Through Abraham, God initiates a plan to bring salvation to the world, a plan that will span generations and culminate in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. However, Abraham's journey is not without its challenges. God calls him to leave behind his homeland, his family, and everything familiar to him. In response, Abraham displays incredible faith, stepping out into the unknown, guided only by God's promise. His faith becomes the foundation of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Abraham's obedience and trust in God's promise serve as a model of faith for future generations. In fact, Abraham is often referred to as the father of faith because of his willingness to trust in God, even when the future was uncertain. Another significant element of God's promise to Abraham is the idea that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This points forward to the global impact of the covenant, which ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Through Abraham's descendants, God's redemptive plan will extend beyond Israel to all nations. In this way, the call of Abraham represents the beginning of God's mission to redeem the world, and it shows that God's promises are not limited to one group of people, but are meant for everyone. This turning point in Genesis is not just about the creation of a nation. It's about the beginning of a divine mission that will transform history. Through Abraham, we see the start of a journey that will lead to the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all nations through one man's faith. The call of Abraham is, therefore, one of the most crucial moments in the Bible, as it sets in motion the events that will lead to the ultimate act of redemption. In Genesis 15, one of the most profound moments in the Bible occurs. God formalizes his covenant with Abraham, an agreement that will shape the destiny of Israel and set the stage for the coming of the Messiah. After years of waiting, Abraham, still childless, wonders how God's promise of countless descendants can be fulfilled. It's in this moment of doubt that God reaffirms his promise, telling Abraham to look up at the stars. "Look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to number them. So shall your descendants be." The imagery of the stars in the sky becomes a symbol of God's boundless blessing, a promise that Abraham's offspring will become a great nation. But this covenant goes beyond words. God initiates a dramatic and symbolic ritual that solidifies his promise. In the ancient Near East, covenants were often sealed by the cutting of animals and both parties walking between the pieces, symbolizing their commitment to the agreement. However, in this instance, something remarkable happens. After Abraham prepares the sacrificial animals, he falls into a deep sleep, and God alone, represented by a blazing torch and a smoking firepot, passes between the pieces. This act signifies that the covenant is entirely dependent on God's faithfulness, not on Abraham's. God takes full responsibility for fulfilling the promise. This moment marks a pivotal shift, as God binds himself to his promise through an unbreakable covenant. It's a powerful foreshadowing of God's grace, showing that his plan for redemption rests on his initiative and commitment, not on human effort. The covenant with Abraham not only sets the foundation for the nation of Israel, but also points to the coming of the Messiah, through whom all nations will be blessed. In this way, the covenant transcends its immediate context, becoming a cornerstone of God's plan to restore humanity. This covenant also serves as a reminder that, even in times of doubt, God's promises are sure. Abraham's journey of faith, from doubt to belief, mirrors the spiritual journey of all believers, trusting in God's faithfulness even when the future seems uncertain. Through this covenant, we see that God is not only a promise maker, but a promise keeper, and his plans for redemption will come to pass, no matter the obstacles. After years of waiting, God's promise to Abraham is finally fulfilled when Sarah, at an advanced age, gives birth to their son, Isaac. This moment is more than just the birth of a child. It is the physical manifestation of God's covenant, a sign of his faithfulness and power to do the impossible. For Abraham and Sarah, the birth of Isaac represents the culmination of their faith journey, but it is only the beginning of a greater test that would push Abraham's faith to the ultimate limit. God's command in Genesis 22 strikes at the heart of everything Abraham holds dear. He is instructed to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, the very son through whom God promised to build a great nation. The emotional weight of this command is overwhelming. The long-awaited child, the promise fulfilled, now seems to be taken away in a cruel twist. Yet, in this profound moment, Abraham's faith in God's plan remains steadfast. He believes, even if he cannot understand, that God's promises are true, no matter how impossible the situation seems. As Abraham prepares to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, he experiences the greatest test of faith recorded in the Bible. With a heavy heart but unwavering trust in God's provision, Abraham raises the knife. In that intense moment, an angel of the Lord intervenes, calling out to Abraham to stop. God sees Abraham's obedience and provides a ram caught in a thicket as a substitute sacrifice. This dramatic event not only solidifies Abraham's faith, but also foreshadows a greater sacrifice yet to come, when God himself would offer his own Son, Jesus Christ, as a sacrifice for humanity. This story is a powerful display of faith, obedience, and the complexity of God's plan. Through Abraham's willingness to give up Isaac, we see a picture of God's own willingness to offer his son for the redemption of the world. Abraham's trust in God's promise becomes an enduring symbol of faith that resonates through the ages, reminding believers that true faith often requires surrender, but in that surrender, God's plan unfolds perfectly. Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau, represent one of the most intense sibling rivalries in biblical history, a story filled with tension, deception, and ultimate reconciliation. Even before their birth, Genesis 25 tells us that the twins struggled in their mother's womb, a foreshadowing of the strife that would define their relationship. Esau, the older brother, was a skilled hunter, loved by his father Isaac, while Jacob, the younger, was quiet and favored by their mother, Rebekah. From the start, these brothers were divided, not just by their personalities, but by the roles they would play in God's plan. Their rivalry reaches its peak when Jacob, urged by Rebekah, deceives his aging blind father Isaac to steal Esau's blessing, an act that would alter the course of their lives. Jacob, disguised as Esau, wears goatskins to mimic Esau's hairy arms and presents himself to Isaac, who unknowingly grants him the blessing meant for his elder son. This act of deception causes a deep rift between the brothers, leading Esau to vow vengeance and forcing Jacob to flee for his life. The story is not only one of human deceit, but also of divine sovereignty. Despite Jacob's flaws, God chooses to work through him, continuing the covenant he made with Abraham and Isaac. Jacob's story reminds us that God often works through imperfect people. His deceitful nature contrasts with God's faithfulness, yet God chooses Jacob to be the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. This complex narrative highlights the themes of grace, redemption, and the intricate ways God fulfills his promises, even through flawed human actions. Jacob's struggle for the birthright and blessing mirrors humanity's own struggle for significance, purpose, and God's favor. Through Jacob and Esau, we learn that God's plans will prevail, no matter the human obstacles. In Genesis 28, as Jacob flees from his brother Esau, he finds himself alone in the wilderness, uncertain of his future. That night, while resting with a stone as his pillow, Jacob receives a profound vision, a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. This moment is far more than just a dream. It's a divine encounter, symbolizing the ongoing connection between heaven and earth. The ladder represents God's constant presence with his people, showing that despite Jacob's exile, God's plan is still unfolding. As Jacob watches the angels, messengers between heaven and earth, he receives a personal promise from God. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. God renews the covenant promise he made to Abraham and Isaac, ensuring that Jacob's descendants will inherit the land and become a great nation. This vision is a turning point for Jacob, a reassurance that even in his wandering and imperfection, God remains faithful to his promises. The ladder symbolizes not only God's guidance, but the eventual restoration and reconciliation between Jacob and his destiny. Jacob's ladder becomes a timeless image of God's direct involvement with his creation. It reminds us that God's reach extends to the most unlikely places and people, and that his plans, though sometimes difficult to understand, are always in motion. The vision of the ladder also foreshadows a greater connection between heaven and earth, one that would ultimately be fulfilled through Jesus Christ, bridging the gap between God and humanity. In Genesis 32, Jacob's life reaches a defining moment, an intense and mysterious encounter that would transform him forever. On the night before meeting his estranged brother Esau, Jacob is alone, weighed down by fear and anxiety about the looming confrontation. His past deceptions haunt him, and the uncertainty of the future leaves him vulnerable. As the night deepens, a mysterious figure suddenly appears and initiates a wrestling match with Jacob. But this is no ordinary struggle. Jacob realizes that this is a divine being, and the battle becomes both physical and spiritual. This moment is symbolic of Jacob's entire life, marked by striving, deception, and wrestling with his own identity and his relationship with God. For hours, they wrestle through the night, neither gaining the upper hand. Despite the pain, exhaustion, and his dislocated hip, Jacob refuses to let go. His physical weakness is matched by his unyielding spirit. He is determined to receive something more from this encounter. Jacob, whose name means supplanter or deceiver, is no longer fighting just for survival. He's fighting for a new identity, a new blessing. When the mysterious figure finally touches Jacob's hip, dislocating it effortlessly, Jacob still holds on, insisting, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It's a pivotal moment of surrender and strength, as Jacob acknowledges that he is utterly dependent on God's blessing and grace. In response, the figure asks for Jacob's name, not just to identify him, but as a way of making Jacob confront the reality of who he is. When Jacob admits his name, which carries the weight of his past as a deceiver, the figure blesses him with a new name, Israel, meaning he who struggles with God. This new name signifies a profound transformation. No longer defined by deceit, Jacob becomes the father of a nation that will be known for its covenant relationship with God. His limp, the physical result of his encounter, serves as a permanent reminder of both his struggle and his submission to God. This moment marks the birth of the nation of Israel, a people who will forever be connected to the name and legacy of Jacob. His wrestling match with God is a powerful metaphor for the spiritual journey of all believers, a journey marked by struggles, surrender, and ultimately divine blessing. Through Jacob's story, we learn that true transformation often comes through wrestling with our own weaknesses, fears, and sins, and that it is in these moments of vulnerability that God meets us with grace and a new identity. Joseph's journey is a tale of resilience, betrayal, despair, and ultimately divine triumph. As Jacob's favored son, Joseph became the target of his brothers' jealousy, which drove them to sell him into slavery. Stripped of his home and status, Joseph was taken to Egypt, where his integrity and faith were severely tested. In this foreign land, he served faithfully, but was falsely accused by his master's wife and unjustly imprisoned. Yet even in prison, Joseph did not lose his faith. His unwavering trust in God, even in the face of betrayal and suffering, sets him apart as a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. During his time in prison, Joseph's unique gift of interpreting dreams was revealed. His ability to discern God's messages through dreams reached Pharaoh's ears when Egypt's ruler was tormented by visions that none of his advisors could explain. Joseph, brought out of prison, stood before Pharaoh and confidently revealed the meaning of the dreams. Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Pharaoh, seeing the wisdom bestowed upon Joseph by God, elevated him from the depths of the dungeon to the second highest position in the land. Joseph was entrusted with the monumental task of preparing Egypt for the coming famine, a responsibility that would ultimately save the nation and his own family from disaster. This divine twist in Joseph's story is a powerful testament to God's providence and his ability to turn even the most painful circumstances into opportunities for redemption and purpose. Joseph's ascent from slave to ruler wasn't just about personal success, it was about God's larger plan for his people. When famine struck, it was Joseph's foresight and God's blessing that allowed Egypt to survive. It was through this famine that Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food, not realizing that the brother they had betrayed was now the one who would save them. Joseph's decision to forgive his brothers rather than seek revenge reveals the depth of his faith and understanding of God's sovereignty. Joseph's journey teaches us that God's timing is always perfect, even when life seems darkest. What his brothers intended for evil, God used for good, positioning Joseph not only to save Egypt, but to preserve the lineage that would eventually bring forth the Messiah. His story reminds us that no matter how dire our circumstances may seem, God is always at work behind the scenes, shaping our lives according to his perfect plan. Years after Joseph's miraculous rise to power in Egypt, a severe famine strikes the entire region, impacting not only Egypt but also Canaan, where Joseph's family resides. Faced with starvation, Joseph's brothers, who years earlier had sold him into slavery, are forced to seek help from Egypt. Little do they know that the powerful governor they are about to encounter is the very brother they betrayed. Joseph, recognizing them immediately, is overwhelmed with emotion. But instead of revealing his identity, he decides to test their character to see whether they have changed since the day they betrayed him. Joseph is no longer the naive young man they sold. He is now in a position of power, and with that power comes the ability to assess whether his brothers are worthy of trust and reconciliation. Joseph's first test is subtle. He accuses them of being spies, a claim that shakes them to their core. They vehemently deny the charge, but Joseph persists, demanding that they prove their honesty by bringing their youngest brother Benjamin to Egypt. The mention of Benjamin, the only other son of Rachel, reveals a deep family vulnerability. It tests whether the brothers, who once resented Joseph for being their father's favorite, would protect Benjamin, now Jacob's beloved. This challenge forces the brothers to confront their past actions and decide whether they will sacrifice Benjamin as they once did Joseph or protect him. When they return with Benjamin, Joseph stages a final test. He plants a silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accuses him of theft. The brothers, horrified at the prospect of losing Benjamin, offer themselves in his place, demonstrating their newfound sense of loyalty and responsibility. This act of self-sacrifice is a pivotal moment for Joseph. It's clear to him that his brothers have truly changed. They are no longer driven by jealousy and hatred. Instead, they are willing to protect their younger brother at any cost. Finally, in one of the most emotional scenes in the Bible, Joseph can no longer contain his feelings. With tears streaming down his face, he reveals his true identity to his brothers, saying, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Shock and disbelief wash over his brothers as they realize the man standing before them is the brother they thought they had lost forever. Initially, they are gripped by fear, expecting Joseph to exact revenge, but Joseph reassures them with words that echo the theme of divine providence. "What you meant for evil, God used for good." Joseph's journey from betrayal to forgiveness shows us the depth of God's plan, even when we can't see it, and the power of reconciliation after great betrayal. His willingness to forgive his brothers reflects the overarching narrative of God's grace and the possibility of redemption for all. This story, filled with emotion, serves as a powerful testament to the transformative power of forgiveness and grace. Joseph's ability to forgive, despite the immense pain his brothers caused him, illustrates that even the deepest wounds can be healed when we trust in God's greater plan. The reunion of Joseph and his brothers marks not only the restoration of a family, but also the preservation of the covenant God made with Abraham, a covenant that would ultimately lead to the salvation of many nations. As Jacob neared the end of his life, he summoned his 12 sons for a prophetic moment that would have profound implications for the future of Israel. In Genesis 49, we see Jacob, not just as a father, but as a patriarch, speaking words over each of his sons that would shape the course of history. Each of his sons would become the head of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and their destinies were intertwined with God's redemptive plan for the world. This wasn't a simple blessing. It was a declaration of what was to come, a foreshadowing of the roles that each tribe would play in the unfolding biblical narrative. For some, the blessing was filled with promise and honor. Judah, for instance, is likened to a lion, a symbol of strength, leadership, and royalty. Jacob's prophetic words over Judah pointed directly to the lineage that would bring forth King David and eventually the Messiah, Jesus Christ. This lion imagery also underscored Judah's future role as the royal tribe, leading Israel in both spiritual and political matters. On the other hand, Jacob's words to Reuben and Simeon reflect the consequences of their earlier misdeeds, reminding us that actions have lasting impacts. Reuben, who had once been destined for leadership as the firstborn, forfeited that honor due to his lack of self-control. The blessings were as varied as the sons themselves. Levi, along with Simeon, was rebuked for his violent actions, but Levi's descendants would later become the priestly tribe, serving God in the tabernacle and later the temple. Joseph, the favored son, received a particularly rich blessing. Jacob described him as a fruitful vine whose branches would extend beyond the walls. This prophetic imagery reflected the future prosperity of Joseph's descendants, Ephraim and Manasseh, whose tribes would flourish in the northern kingdom of Israel. Even Benjamin, described as a ravenous wolf, would become known for producing fierce warriors. Through these blessings, Jacob was not just speaking to the present moment. He was declaring the future roles these tribes would play in the history of Israel and ultimately the world. The 12 tribes would face exile, war, division, and restoration, but through it all, God's covenant with them would remain steadfast. Jacob's final words over his sons show that God can use both strengths and weaknesses to accomplish his divine purposes. Jacob's blessings are also a reminder to us of the enduring nature of God's promises. Despite their flaws, each of Jacob's sons would contribute to the unfolding of God's plan. Through the 12 tribes, the nation of Israel would emerge, bearing the covenant that began with Abraham. Jacob's final act as a patriarch was to lay the foundation for a nation destined to carry God's light to the world. In one of the most emotional moments in Genesis, Joseph, who has endured years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, stands before the very brothers who sold him into slavery. After carefully testing their hearts and seeing their remorse, Joseph reveals his true identity to them. His words, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good," encapsulate one of the most profound themes in all of Scripture: God's providence. Joseph's life, marked by injustice and hardship, demonstrates that despite human intentions for harm, God's plan was never derailed. In fact, it was through the very act of betrayal that Joseph was divinely placed in a position of influence, enabling him not only to save Egypt, but also to preserve his own family, the future nation of Israel, during the Great Famine. This powerful statement by Joseph is a reminder that no matter how dark or difficult our circumstances may seem, God is always at work, orchestrating events for a greater purpose. Through Joseph's suffering, God positioned him to bring about a monumental deliverance. The forgiveness Joseph offers his brothers is not only an act of personal grace, but reflects the heart of God's mercy toward all of humanity. This moment, which could have been filled with bitterness and revenge, instead becomes one of reconciliation and restoration. Joseph's act of grace sets the stage for the survival and future prosperity of the Israelites, preserving the lineage through which God's redemptive plan for humanity would continue. Joseph's rise to power and eventual reunion with his brothers reveals that God's providence does not mean that evil becomes good or that suffering is inconsequential. Instead, it shows that God is capable of using even the most painful and unjust situations for his ultimate purposes. Joseph's journey from betrayal and slavery to power and reconciliation teaches us that God's hand is always at work, even when we cannot understand the trials we face. This theme of redemption echoes throughout Scripture, culminating in the ultimate example, Jesus Christ. Just as Joseph forgave his brothers and saw God's plan in their actions, Jesus' crucifixion, though intended for evil, became the foundation of humanity's salvation through God's sovereign plan. The story of Joseph teaches us that God's purposes will always prevail, even when life seems unjust or filled with suffering. His forgiveness is a mirror of the greater forgiveness we receive through Jesus Christ, where what was intended for evil, Christ's death on the cross, became the ultimate victory over sin and death. Joseph's story is not only a story of personal redemption, but also a symbol of God's unfailing grace and ability to turn human failure into divine victory. As we come to the conclusion of the book of Genesis, the narrative shifts from the grand stories of God's promises to the quieter, reflective moments of death and legacy. First, we witness the death of Jacob, the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel. After blessing his sons and giving prophetic words about their future, Jacob's life comes to an end. His final request is to be buried in the land of Canaan, the promised land. the land that God swore to give his descendants. This burial in the promised land symbolizes the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reinforcing the central theme of Genesis, that God's covenant is enduring and trustworthy. Jacob's death marks the end of an era, but his burial in Canaan foreshadows the future exodus of his descendants back to this land. Genesis doesn't just conclude with Jacob's death, though. Soon after, we see the end of Joseph's extraordinary life. Before he dies, Joseph speaks prophetically to his family, reassuring them that although they are in Egypt, God's promise to lead them back to the promised land remains firm. He makes them swear that when God leads them out of Egypt, they will carry his bones with them to the land promised to their ancestors. Joseph's final words are filled with hope, a reminder that even in death, God's promises endure. Genesis closes with the reassurance that, though the story of these individuals has ended, God's redemptive plan continues, preparing the way for the great exodus and the fulfillment of his covenant. Joseph's confidence in God's future deliverance stands as a powerful testament to his faith. He had seen firsthand how God's providence worked through his life, turning betrayal into blessing, suffering into salvation. Even in his final moments, Joseph's faith in God's promise did not waver. His death isn't the end of the story, but rather a transition, pointing forward to the continuation of God's work in the lives of the Israelites. This closing chapter of Genesis reminds us that God's promises transcend generations, death, and time itself. The legacy of faith left by Jacob and Joseph is one that endures beyond their lifetimes, anchored in the belief that God's covenant is eternal and unbreakable. As Genesis comes to a close, it leaves us with the hopeful expectation of God's future deliverance and the assurance that he is always faithful to fulfill his promises. As we reach the end of the book of Genesis, it's clear that this is more than just the story of creation. It's the foundation of God's eternal promises and redemptive plan for humanity. From the creation of the world to the fall of man, and from the covenant with Abraham to Joseph's powerful act of forgiveness, Genesis is filled with reminders of God's faithfulness. Despite humanity's failures, God's love and desire to bring us back to him never waver. The stories in Genesis reveal that God's plan is unstoppable. His covenants, his promises, and his redemptive work are all woven into the fabric of Genesis, laying the foundation for the entire Bible. The secrets we've uncovered remind us that God is always working for our good, even when we can't see it. This journey through Genesis reveals a God who is deeply invested in his creation, a God who walks with us, even in our brokenness. No matter how far we fall, his covenant remains, and his desire to bring us back into relationship with him is at the heart of every story. From the Garden of Eden to Joseph's declaration of forgiveness, we see the unfolding of God's grand plan, a plan that reaches its climax in the redemption offered through Jesus Christ. Genesis sets the stage for everything that follows in the Bible, reminding us that God's promises are unchanging and his faithfulness endures through every generation. As we look back at the themes of creation, fall, and redemption, we are reminded that God's plan continues today. He is still at work, redeeming, restoring, and fulfilling his promises in the lives of his people. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the book of Genesis and want to uncover more of the Bible's hidden truths, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. How has the story of Genesis impacted your faith? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a revelation from God's Word. Join us on our next journey through the Bible's mysteries and truths as we continue to explore the depths of Scripture and what it means for your spiritual walk.